Hey everyone, here's another video that I have for you, and I think you might find this interesting, especially if you are familiar with the Charles Manson case and the Manson family. So, has anybody ever wondered, but not understood, why the Manson family were not executed? For reference, at the Tate LaBianca trial, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, and of course Charles Manson were all found guilty and convicted in 1971 and were given the death penalty that same year. Also found guilty in 1971 was Tex Watson, and he too was given the death penalty. Bobby Beausoleil, who was found guilty for the murder of Gary Hinman, was also sentenced to death. Interestingly, Steve Grogan, also known as Clem Tufts, was found guilty for his trial in the murder of Shorty Shea, and he was initially actually sentenced to death. But apparently on December 23rd, 1971, Judge James Colts had changed his sentence to life imprisonment, stating, Grogan was too stupid and too hopped up on drugs to decide anything on his own. So at the time, Steve Grogan was the only Manson member to have had his sentence changed from death to life in prison. And at that point in time, the rest were still sentenced to death and awaiting their execution. But this ended up changing, and none of the Manson family were actually executed, despite being sentenced to death. The reason for this is because on February 18, 1972, the state of California Supreme Court struck down the death penalty, stating that it was cruel and unusual punishment. At the time, California had the largest death row in all of America, which actually still holds true today. This ruling came after a lawsuit by the NAACP and ACLU in what is a famously known case as People versus Anderson. At the time, there hadn't actually been an execution in the United States of America for 4 years. There was also, that same year, 1972, another case, which was actually from the U.S. Supreme Court, that also temporarily pretty much banned the death penalty. So, from the state side and the federal side, for a short time being, the United States of America pretty much outlawed the death penalty. So, interestingly, when this happened, the governor for the time of the state of California, Ronald Reagan, had actually criticized this decision, stating that he was deeply disappointed and somewhat shocked. It's a case of courts setting themselves up above the people and the legislature. So at the time, California had actually executed 503 people total before the death penalty was outlawed at that point, with apparently 308 of those being by hanging and 195 were by the gas chamber in San Quentin. And out of all of those people, only 4 were women. So because the death penalty was ruled unconstitutional, this actually meant that people like Charles Manson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Saran, and John Linley Frazier, of course among others like Tex Watson and Susan Atkins and everyone else, all of those people on death row had their sentences commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole. So from there have still been questions why. All right, the death penalty was outlawed, they can't be executed, but why do they have a chance of parole? Even to this day, all of those members of the Manson family have the eligibility for parole. But why? Looking this up, part of this seems to stem from just how the justice system worked at the time. For many parts of the U.S., it just didn't seem to be a thing to have life without parole. Now, I don't know for sure for every single state in the Union, but it just doesn't seem that this was something that I guess our justice system ever thought about. And I don't know exactly when this changed for every state. Of course, this video is not comprehensive, but it is very interesting to note that at some point in time, a convicted serial killer like Tex Watson could potentially have gotten parole. And technically he still can, but let's leave that for another video, right? I looked this up though. What was an early instance, in the newspaper archives for life without parole? As at least listed in maybe articles in 1972, from California. And I came across this very interesting article and bill that was proposed and then rejected. So, in the state of California, there is a bill that was introduced in 1972 after the death penalty was outlawed that actually would have made crimes which had death as their penalty to be substituted for life without parole. So basically, there were lawmakers out there that did want to change death penalty's outlawed, now these people get life without parole instead. Which makes sense, right? But for whatever reason, this ended up being rejected. So, from an article from 1972 in particular, it stated that there was a 30 to 38 vote that, just barely didn't make it. So despite the fact that there were people who did think, okay, we can't execute Charles Manson or Patricia Krenwinkel or Susan Atkins, they also shouldn't have the possibility for parole. This was also rejected, which is just a very interesting piece of history, right? So, interestingly, though, that same year, 1972, the death penalty was voted back into the state of California thanks to the Proposition 17. But, of course, because the death penalty had been outlawed from a federal level that same year, the execution still couldn't technically happen. Eventually that was repealed back too, and other states now still have the death penalty, such as the state of Texas. California itself wouldn't execute another inmate until 1992. So, a rather short video, but hopefully this answers some questions if anybody else has been curious. Why wasn't the Manson family executed? The death penalty was outlawed. Why were they given the possibility of parole? Well, apparently any legislation that would have denied parole was also voted out. Just weird. Let me know what you think about this one, because I find this topic to be very interesting. And I'll see you in the next video.